Today, we're diving into the really dynamic and honestly often dramatic relationship between philosophy and logic. You know those deep philosophical questions about the nature of reality? Well, we're going to see how those very questions have literally forged the tools we use to think.
So let's start with a really basic question. When you think of logic, what comes to mind? Is it just some finished set of rules, something that was carved in stone by the ancients, and that's it? Case closed?
Yeah, not even close. The truth is, logic isn't some static monument that we just admire. It's a living, breathing science. And the engine that drives its evolution, the thing that's constantly pushing it to grow and change, is philosophy.
All right, so here's our game plan. We'll start with where logic even came from, then we'll see how these brain-twisting paradoxes actually forced it to evolve. From there, we'll explore the whole universe of new logical systems that popped up, and we'll even zoom in on this ever-changing idea of what it means for something to be the same. And finally, we'll tie it all together to see why philosophy really is logic's driving force.
Okay, let's dive in. We're starting way back in ancient Greece, where logic wasn't, its own separate subject you took in school. It was born directly out of philosophy, as thinkers started shifting from asking about the world to asking about how we think about the world, what they called the art of thought. And the people behind this were, well, absolute giants. You had Aristotle, who basically took the messy principles of rational argument and organized them into a real science. Centuries down the line, Leibniz saw logic as a branch growing from the deep philosophical root of metaphysics. And then Hegel came along and saw logic as science kind of looking in the mirror, a way for inquiry to think about itself.
So what is logic when you get right down to it? Well, it's the science that hands us the tools for a few key jobs: to see the necessary connections between things, to grasp the real essence of things and of truth itself, and of course to build rock-solid proofs while tearing down false claims.
And that right there gets to the heart of it. Underneath all the symbols and the complex rules, logic is driven by one of philosophy's oldest, biggest questions. What is truth, and how in the world do we find it?
But what happens when the tools you're using to find that truth suddenly break? That's exactly what happened when paradoxes arrived on the scene, these weird problems that challenge the very foundations of reasoning.
Now, what's really fascinating here is that these paradoxes weren't seen as failures. Instead, they became engines of logical evolution. Think about that. There were these intellectual crises that forced thinkers to just stop, hit the brakes, go back to square one, and re-examine the most basic assumptions they were making about reason itself. Let's look at maybe the most famous of these engines, Russell's paradox. It's a total mind bender. Okay, try to wrap your head around this. Imagine a set, we'll just call it R, that contains every set that does not contain itself. Seems simple enough, right? But this leads to a simple and yet completely devastating question. Does our set, R, contain itself? Let's actually think this through for a second. And here is the beautiful, maddening trap. If the set does contain itself, it violates its own rule, so it shouldn't be in there. But if it doesn't contain itself, then it fits the rule perfectly and it must be in there. It's a total, inescapable contradiction. This wasn't just a fun little puzzle, it was a massive crack in the foundations of logic. And Russell's paradox wasn't some isolated incident. These philosophical cracks were popping up all over. You had ancient paradoxes from Zeno that made people wonder if logic could even properly describe things like motion and infinity. And more, thinkers realized there was this huge gap between our messy, continuous experience of the world and the clean, discrete, absolute boxes of formal logic. So what do you do when your single trusted system of logic starts to show some serious cracks? You don't just patch it up. No, you build new ones. And this crisis sparked an incredible creative explosion. This philosophical split was a major turning point. It's what transformed logic from being this single, black and white monolith where everything was simply true or false, period, into this vibrant, colored universe of many different logical systems, each one designed for a specific purpose. The result was just this explosion of new systems. You had logics designed to manage contradictions instead of just crashing. Others introduced a third value, like undecided or possible, moving way beyond simple true or false. Each one was a new tool designed to handle a specific philosophical problem, from vagueness to uncertainty to the limits of our knowledge. To make this really concrete, let's just compare classical logic with one of the new kids on the block, intuitionistic logic. Classical logic says truth is just out there, waiting for us to discover it. But intuitionism has a totally different philosophy. It says we have to construct a proof for something to be considered true. And that one little shift changes everything. Suddenly, a statement can be undecided, and proving something isn't false is not the same as proving it's true. It just goes to show your core philosophy literally rewrites the rules of reason.
And this philosophical push didn't just create whole new systems. It forced a complete reevaluation of the most basic concepts we use, like what it even means for two things to be the same.
I mean, the concept of same has been evolving for centuries. Aristotle got the ball rolling by separating the idea of being the exact same thing versus just the same kind of thing. Then Leibniz tightened that up, saying same means they have to share every single property. More recently, thinkers like Geach argued that identity is always relative to what you're talking about. For example, two prints can be the same picture, but they definitely aren't the same physical object.
And this leads us to a really powerful modern idea, the interval concept of identity. It basically says that in the real world, sameness isn't some perfect infinitesimal point. It's a range, an acceptable interval of indistinguishability that depends entirely on the context and our ability to even measure it.
Okay, so let's bring it all home. What is the fundamental mechanism here? How does philosophy actually act as logic's driving force?
Well, the key is a tool we all use called abstraction. But it's not just making things simpler. The source material calls it a cognitive technology, a way we actively shape reality so that our theories can work with it. Think about a frictionless surface in physics class. We know it doesn't really exist, but making that abstraction lets us build an incredibly powerful theory. Logic is built on these kinds of abstractions.
And that's the cycle right there. It is philosophy's job to question our fundamental abstractions, our big assumptions about truth, about identity, about reality itself. And when those questions expose a problem, or a paradox, or a limitation, that's what forces logic to evolve. It forces us to invent new tools and build more robust, more nuanced systems.
This leaves us with a really fascinating final thought. The rules of reason aren't fixed. They're shaped by the very questions we dare to ask. So, it makes you wonder, what fundamental assumption, one that we all take for granted every single day, should we be questioning next?